Did it sound okay for that? This okay? This text, what we've been doing, and I think it's what we should continue to do, is we'll meditate as we go along a bit. So maybe we just start with a very short, sometimes we meditate for longer at the beginning, but I think it's probably more useful to meditate on as we go along and cover certain topics. But um, but always at the beginning, we just take a moment to to connect to our motivation. And so part of the point is that this text by Maitreya that we're studying, the Abhisamaya Alamkara, is a text on the Mahayana path or about the Mahayana path. So so that means it's a path connected to great love, great compassion, and bodhicitta, the wish to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of all beings. You could just take a moment, like cultivating that kind of motivation. That actually, it's kind of true, isn't it? There's no reason to study this kind of topic except for love and compassion. And we could just remember briefly, right, how first of all, that our own welfare and the welfare of others are totally interdependent. So everyone, all sentient beings are the same in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. And that way, there's no difference between myself and others. Actually, and if I follow, like, for myself, we each, pause and contemplate, right? We check our own experience on this. It's a long, we could do a very extensive contemplation. We'll just do briefly. But first of all, like, I and others are the same in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. Just as deeply as I want to be happy and well and don't want to be miserable and in pain, right? Whether it's like animals or humans, we're all exactly just as deeply others want that. And then if I exclusively follow a kind of self-centered approach, actually all the problems and sufferings come from that. It's one of the teachings of Buddhist psychology. Everything from, like, inner suffering of insecurity, loneliness, sorrow, relationship problems, family problems, societal problems. all my own negative karma, they all come from that kind of selfish focus. Whereas a life, whether it's a single day or an entire life, right, spent with love, right, with an open-hearted attitude that sees everyone as precious, it cherishes well-being of others and myself. It's not, you don't leave yourself out, but that kind of open-hearted, loving attitude is the cause of happiness. Mhm. So I dedicate myself to love and compassion, which is an approach that, first of all, leads me to happiness and then also leads others to happiness. So my purpose in studying this text is to learn about the paths that lead to enlightenment for the welfare of myself and others. In order to follow those kinds of paths, in order to be of greater benefit to myself and others. And with that kind of motivation, just want to say the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of generosity and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha, benefit all sentient people. So just brief, remembering our motivation. And then I had said that we'd start now uh, some topics in the Abhisamayalankara, like particularly looking at like a few in there's a summary text that talks about key Buddhist concepts and so on. So anyway, in brief, like so this in general, the text, the ornament for clear realizations, right? The Abhisamayalankara, that's the translation of that, right? Ornament for clear realizations. Um, is a teaching by Maitreya. That's the statue of Maitreya there. Um, his name means loving one, right? Maitreya is love. Maitri, it's love. So and that so this text is said to be a teaching, as I mentioned once before, about the hidden meaning of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and the because actually the explicit meaning, the obvious meaning of those sutras of the Buddha is emptiness, the ultimate nature of reality. That's what those like what the Buddha is overtly teaching in those sutras when you study them, and you can read them. They're in English now. And they beautiful sutras, and if you read them, you'll see that the main subject that the Buddha is sort of verbalizing and explaining is the ultimate nature of phenomena, their emptiness and inherent existence. And this text teaches some about that. But there are many teach. The actually the middle way school teaches most clearly about that. And then this text, the Abhisamayalankara, is said to teach the hidden meaning or the implicit meaning, you could say, which is the path. How does a person progress? How does a bodhisattva, how does a being progress on the path? What are the stages one goes through in one's spiritual development? And and those are explicit because implicit rather, or hidden because the Buddha didn't say this is stage one, this is stage two in those sutras. If you read them, it's not that clear. But what this text does is sort of show how the way the Buddha presents certain meditations, certain experiences in the sutra, and those correlate to different stages, and you have to progress through those stages in order. And Maitreya explains all of that very clearly and in great detail. Abhisamayalankara, and so we're not going to try to study all of that because the Abhisamayalankara is a huge text. And I said that before. I think sometimes the monks in the monastery full time, like living in, they all day, they study that for like 7 years sometimes. So obviously we're not going to try to do that. Um, but Lama Zopa Rinpoche had suggested studying the 37 harmonies with enlightenment in particular. That's in this fourth chapter. But I think to understand those, there are a few like so we're going to study those, but I want to step back for a moment and say, so this idea of these like the paths that one goes through. In order to understand the 37 harmonies with enlightenment well, it's useful to understand at least some core points, which are and one of the core points is there are like five paths or stages. Like, they call them the five paths, but they're actually sequential. Um, that a person goes through in the process of becoming enlightened. And they say everybody has to go through them, and they go through them in a certain order. And so it'd be useful to kind of go through those a little bit, and you'll see that it'd be hard to understand the 37 harmonies with enlightenment if you don't understand something about these five paths. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of those to start with, because without that, I think it'd be hard to understand what the 37 harmonies are getting at. And also, it's one of the core points of the Abhisamayalankara, so it'd be good to at least know that much. But the first thing I wanted to start with, and the text starts with that, so is as I said, paths, right? Tibetan, it's like lam. So path, like lamrim. Those of you who've heard lamrim, right? That's that word, path. So they make a point. They say actually, what is a path? Actually, what does that mean, right? The word, like, to say something's a path. And obviously, on the first of all, obviously it's a metaphor, isn't it? Because it's not something a path. I mean, if you think of a physical object, a path, it's right, something you walk or drive on. Usually walk, I guess. I guess there's a biking path. We say biking path sometimes. So something you travel on. So it's a metaphor, right? To be traveled. Um, but in Buddhism, they make this point. They say, actually, so we say the ornament for clear realizations, right, is the name of the text. And so one point they make is a path is a realization or is a consciousness that's realizing something. So it's a clear realization, actually. So when we say the ornament for clear realizations, you could say the ornament for the path. It's a synonym. Does that make sense? Um, so and so it's an awareness or a consciousness, your own mind, having a certain kind of experience. That's what a path is in Buddhism. Um, and for it to serve as a path in the context that we're studying right now, it has to be conjoined. So in other words, you could have actual experiences, spiritual experiences, but they could not be paths yet. So what I'm getting at is this: is that for a person to have these experiences that we're calling paths, they have to either have generated renunciation of samsara. Sometimes they call it definite emergence, the mind that definitely wants to emerge. I say it's a more accurate translation. We call it renunciation sometimes in English, but I don't know if that's a good. I'm not sure that's a good term. It's a kind of it has a certain I think Judeo-Christian religious connotation. The word renunciation that I don't think is exactly perfect.
It sounds aesthetic.
Yeah, so I don't think the actual Tibetan term is more literally translated as like a mind that definitely wants to emerge from samsara. That's a more accurate, probably, sense. So that means, like, at the minimum, is that, right? So for oneself, one feels, I recognize the nature of samsara and I want to emerge from it. And emerge from it doesn't mean like, I don't know, it's like, it'd be like if somebody, say it right. It's kind of like, you know, it's not really ascetic. It's more like, if somebody's been, say a person, I think I'm just trying to get the feeling of it, like of what was being gotten at. And it's kind of like if you've been addicted to something and then you think, oh, I got to stop this. This is not working. My life sucks. And you're not saying, I want to be dead. You're actually saying, I want to live a better life, right? I want to emerge from what I've been doing and do something different and be in a different state where I'm suffering less, right? That's what this is. But it's not just about one particular substance or one particular behavior. It's about a samsaric way of being, and saying, I don't want to be in a samsaric way. I want to be in a nirvana way, or something like that. So that'd be renunciation. So one kind of path is where the person has developed that kind of state of mind in a kind of non-contrived way. And not that's why I use the analogy of that's why it's a metaphor, use for an example, but or as an example, I guess, of somebody who's been addicted to something. Is one thing when somebody says, "Oh, I should probably stop." That's not renunciation. Renunciation is when the person's like, "I've got to stop. This is not working." And there's like a deep felt sense. So renunciation is like that, but about samsara, if that makes sense. There's a deep experiential felt sense of wanting to emerge from a samsaric way of being. When you have that, and then you have a clear realization of some point that we'll explain a little bit, that's a path. Um, that's not a Mahayana path. Mahayana path means that you not only have renunciation, but you have that same feeling for all beings. Like you feel a kind of love, compassion, and commitment, resolve that, like, I will become enlightened in order to be of help to others. Right? And that becomes uncontrived. And then you have a realization conjoined with that. That's a path. Does that make sense? So that's the definition of a path: is you first have this kind of sense of either personal wish to emerge or universal wish to help all beings emerge, which includes yourself, by the way. You can't help others unless you become enlightened. You can't help somebody else become enlightened. You can't give somebody else what you don't have. You have to become enlightened yourself to help others progress. So you generate those kinds of motivations, and then when you have a clear realization, that's a path. Does that make sense? No, just defining even what's the word path. So then, excuse. Then for once you have that kind of motivation, these paths are clear realizations, right? Or yeah, realizations in your own mind when you realize something. And there are all kinds of realizations you could have, which we're going to start to explain. Um, and actually, that was where, remember last time I said there were like 173 listed, and each of those 173 sometimes have sub things. That's what I mean by it's a very extensive text. It's saying, well, they say bodhisattvas take three countless eons to become a Buddha. So there are a lot of experiences that bodhisattva has. So this test is explaining, wow, what are those kinds of experiences? Um, and then as one progresses, so now going back, there are five paths, right? And they're sequential. You have to complete one to go to the next. And it's not because somebody made a rule like that. It's that you'll see you're not capable. In other words, a person who hasn't had certain experiences won't be capable of certain more exalted experiences um, because it's not possible. It's like it would be like it's kind of the again use similes or metaphors to get at a point, but it's kind of like if you said it's not like somebody saying, oh, there's a rule. If the Buddhists had their choice, they would say, sure, start at the last one. Great. um the issue is like, for example, if you took somebody who's in fourth grade and tried to explain um, graduate level astrophysics to them, they just wouldn't understand what you're talking about, right? Like it's not possible. And it's not that you could, if the teacher could wish, they could explain it, but you have to go step by step in order to understand that, right? If you haven't studied certain kinds of mathematics, you're not going to be able to understand that. It's a bit like that. There are certain things, certain experiences you have to have in order to have later experiences, or you just won't be able to have them. So, okay, then the first of those five paths is called the path of accumulation. And a couple of key points. One is one starts the path of accumulation when one develops, if either renunciation or that bodhicitta motivation. That's the beginning of that. Once you develop that, you're on the path. Um, and then there are three like sub levels of the path of accumulation, and I'm going to present them now from a Mahayana perspective. There's also, because that's with bodhicitta, I'm going to explain them in that context, but there are also the same kinds of paths apply to for somebody just achieving their own individual liberation, but there are slight differences. And one is so on the path of accumulation, there are three sub levels. There's the small, the medium, and the great levels of that. And I'm mentioning that for a couple of reasons. One is on the small level of the path of accumulation, the person has just developed this kind of motivation of extreme compassion, wishing to achieve enlightenment for all beings. but that motivation at that level is still what's the word? It's still new to them, and they could lose it. So it's not yet stable. So in other words, that there are stories of like that where somebody develops that kind of. There's stories like that in some of the sutras actually, where like somebody develops that kind of commitment. I want to achieve enlightenment for all beings, and then they start to get discouraged. Sometimes because beings are hard to help. Sometimes anybody who's alive will notice. And then, or if you try to help people, you notice that pretty quickly, right? It's not so easy. And so they're said to be on the small level of path accumulation. There are examples actually historically of people who sort of generated that motivation and then sort of thought, oh, that's too hard. I'm just going to achieve my own liberation. Um, Once you get to the middle level of those of the path of accumulation, you don't fall back again. So that in other words, that you'll keep they call it gold like your bodhicitta becomes refined like gold, and then you won't lose that motivation anymore. It'll stay with you for all your future lives, actually. So like, which is kind of beautiful in the scripture that you kind of develop a certain at that level of the middle level of the path of accumulation, the force of your compassion becomes strong enough and habitual enough and sort of ingrained in your being enough that even in death, even as you take rebirth, even when it doesn't matter, it'll like be with you in all your future lives. And then another point I'll make is about the reason why I'm mentioning another reason why I'm mentioning the three sub levels of the path of accumulation. And I'm just going to mention this, and we're going to go into it in a lot of detail later in later classes. But of the 37 harmonies with enlightenment, the first four are the four foundations of mindfulness. So, mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind, and mindfulness of phenomena. And those are, they say, fully attained on the small level of the path of accumulation. So those are when you're at that level, that's a big part of what you practice are the four foundations of mindfulness. Now, this is going to be an important point. So to mention is you can start practicing those and all these other 37 harmonies now. You don't have to be at that level to practice them, but you can't fully attain them until that's what like I was saying. It's like you don't matriculate, you can't graduate. It's like you have to be at a certain level of experience of realization to sort of fully attain them or fully actualize them. So we're supposed to practice those now before we get to that level. But when you get to the small level of the path of accumulation, you'll become able to kind of fully actualize them. Um, Also, on this all the levels of the path of accumulation, they sometimes call it accumulation because the person has to study, contemplate, and meditate. So they're kind of also accumulating understanding of the path and how to practice at that level. Um, then, of the 37 harmonies of enlightenment, after the four foundations of mindfulness, next come the four correct abandonings, which we'll go into later. But those are fully attained on the middle level of the path of accumulation. And then the next of the 37 harmonies are another set of four, which are the four legs of a magical emanation. And those are achieved on the great level um, of the path of accumulation. Um, so that's just a sense, right? So the person um, has achieved at that level, they've achieved bodhicitta. And a few things. One is some people, they should call it they say sharp faculty bodhisattvas. Um, Gain a kind of inferential understanding of emptiness before they even achieve the small level of the path of accumulation. Ones who are less sharp achieve it while they're on that path. But either way, you have to achieve it before you. That's one thing that you have to achieve before you can progress past that path. Is a correct inferential cognition of emptiness, of the ultimate nature of reality. Um, Also, this one actually different lamas have said different things, but I checked with Khensa Rinpoche, Gyume Khensa Rinpoche, who's the former abbot of Gyume Tantric College, because different lamas had said different things, and he said some bodhisattva. His answer about calm abiding. He said some bodhisattvas achieve calm abiding before they enter the path of accumulation. Others achieve it while they're on the path of accumulation, but you have to achieve it. So there's certain achievement. You see what I'm getting at about like there are certain things you have to achieve to progress to the next level. So while you're on the path of accumulation, you have to gain an experience of emptiness, not direct cognition, but an inferential cognition of emptiness, where you realize emptiness, actually gain a realization by way of a kind of mental conceptual understanding, but it's a realization. And you also have to gain calm abiding while you're on that path, which is the ability, right, to focus, with to focus your mind for as long as you want in meditative concentration, which is quite an achievement. Um, and so there's a lot that's done on the path of accumulation. Okay, and that's that. Then eventually, the person who's achieved the path of accumulation keeps progressing. And what happens is at the great level of the path of accumulation, that bodhisattva has achieved meditative concentration of calm abiding. And they've also achieved an inferential cognition of the ultimate nature of reality, of emptiness. Um, and there's a common term that you've probably heard in Buddhism. Like if you study Buddhism much, you hear this term. So there's calm abiding and special insight, or they call it what vipassana, and vipassana is special insight. Shamatha. So in Sanskrit, shamatha would be calm abiding, and then vipassana would be special insight. And oftentimes people don't explain what is that, because there are insights and then there's special insight in Buddhism. So I want to differentiate them for a minute because this is important to the five paths. On the great level of path of accumulation, the person has achieved um, a conceptual realization of emptiness, and they've achieved shamatha. Um, but they've not yet achieved actual special insight or vipassana. Because what happens is, this is what I'll describe now what vipassana is. The actual experience of vipassana is where the person has, or a special insight, is that the person has achieved calm abiding. But when you achieve calm abiding, you can concentrate for as long as you want on a chosen object. Say you visualize a Buddha, or you can just, you can visualize a wheel. You can visualize, whatever, an object, for example. Um, and you can concentrate on it for as long as you want, and you don't get tired, and your mind stays very flexible and clear. But then when you have that concentration, and then you try to apply it to understanding something conceptual like emptiness. And what happens is that because you're having to conceptualize, your concentration weakens. And you can't apply that depth of concentration to whatever you're understanding because you have to think. Like when you're just concentrating on one thing, your mind is very peaceful. But once you try to like use your reasoning to understand something, it pulls you out of the depth of your concentration. So then there's a training a practitioner does where they try to unify their deep concentration with insight, with understanding. And for a long time, as they try to do that, what happens is they go into the deep concentration, but they can't quite conceptualize clearly or see clearly, have an insight. Then when they start to have the insight, they can have an insight, but it pulls them out of the concentration. And they keep training at sort of unifying those two, at being able to not lose their concentration while having a penetrative insight into some topic, particularly emptiness, but it could be other topics too, like impermanence. And finally, there comes a point called the union of calm abiding and special insight, or the union of shamatha and vipassana. And what that actually is experientially is that there comes a point, and in the text they say it this way: they say, where at that point, finally, through training, the bodhisattva becomes capable where they're analyzing something to gain insight actually deepens their concentration. It doesn't disturb it anymore because they've learned to unify them. They've learned experientially, and it's just a training. They have to learn how to do that in their own meditative practice, right? So they're sitting and meditating and doing it over and over. And it's like fine tuning a guitar string or something, right? Where they're like, oh, I'm a little too concentrated. I'm not able to analyze clearly. Oh, I'm analyzing a little too conceptually and I'm not able to concentrate. And through experience, they learn how to kind of sort of like a particular comfort zone where they can do both simultaneously. And also their mind gets trained to be able to do both. And finally, there comes a point where they achieve the union of calm abiding and special insight, where they're at what happens is in this meditative deep concentration, calm abiding, they're able to then analyze the ultimate nature of reality, emptiness. And they finally gain this experience where um, they gain a correct conceptual, reasoned understanding of emptiness, and it's unified with their karma binding, so they completely absorb in that experience. It's still subtly conceptual, but it's a very deep, powerful insight at that point. And when that happens, the person enters the path of preparation, the second of the five paths. So, and now do you see why I said earlier, it's not like you can just skip one or the other. In other words, because if you haven't achieved karma binding, then say, if there's no way to say, oh, I'm going to achieve a union of karma binding and special insight. And if you don't have some level of understanding of emptiness, you're not going to suddenly gain it while you're trying to meditate deeply in a meditative state. So you have to have them first, and then you learn to combine them. And once you're able to combine those two, you achieve this thing called the union of shamatha and vipassana, or the union of karma binding and special insight. And at that point, that person has entered the path of preparation. And it's interesting, right? Because that seems like quite a wonderful achievement, actually, and it is quite a wonderful achievement. And yet they call it the path of preparation because it's preparing you for the next path, which is even more remarkable. But this is a remarkable level of achievement, is having achieved the path of preparation at that point. Um, and then again, I'm not going to go into a humongous amount of detail about this, but there are four sub levels of the path of preparation that the person goes through. The first is called heat, and they say that's why they call it that, I guess, is because at that point the bodhisattva gains that through their special insight, they gain a kind of exalted wisdom that begins to burn away their emotions. You could say it's very quite remarkable description. Um, and and I'll go into more detail in future class about this, but the second one is called peak, and the peak level of the path of preparation. And that one, what happens is that they achieve a kind of um, understanding or level of insight, depth of insight, habituation to insight, so that they won't any longer what's the virtue their positive karma will no longer be destroyed by wrong views. Up to that point, you can still gain wrong views about the nature of reality that harm your own inner virtue. At that level, that doesn't happen anymore. Um, and during those first two, the heat and peak levels of the path preparation of the 37 harmonies of enlightenment, one fully attains the five powers. And we'll go into those in a future class. But one point I'll say, for me personally, this was a relief when I learned this. I'll just share it because I thought it was funny. Is the person who achieves the five powers, you say, what's power? What does that mean? And we'll go into those in detail. There's an elaborate teaching on them. But in a very brief way, the person at that level has their understanding of the nature of reality has a kind of power to overcome suffering in their mind and anger and jealousy and greed and all craving and all the different kind of mental afflictions. They gain a kind of power over those. And what was a relief to me was I was like, oh, you have to achieve that level to have that. So sometimes it's like frustrating when it's hard to overcome a mental affliction. And you go, well, once you get to that level, it'll be a lot easier. But I'm not there yet. So okay, be patient and keep practicing. You know, because sometimes I don't know, for me, I had that wrong understanding a couple of times where I was like, I don't know, I would meditate on emptiness when I was having some kind of difficult experience. I'd be like, well, it's not really, I don't know, I'm not really able to get power over that experience. And then I was like, oh, this is the level where that doesn't happen anymore. When you get to those levels, you no longer have the experience of it, of your your mental afflictions don't overpower you, you overpower them. Until you get to that level, it's not so easy sometimes to overpower them.
Is that part of the preparation?
The main preparation, that's a power you get. The main preparation is the preparation for the path of seeing, for seeing reality directly, which we'll get to in a minute. But and then the next two sub levels of the path of preparation are the forbearance or patience, they sometimes call it level. At one point, that's interesting about that level is when the person gets to that level, they will no longer they can't fall to the lower realms again. So up to that level, it's still possible for bodhisattva to have a bad rebirth. At that level, it no longer, they pass the point of being able to have bad rebirths. And then the final sub level of the path of preparation is called the supreme mundane quality. or the supreme mundane dharma, the supreme mundane thing. And that's the last part of the path of preparation. Um, by the way, on those last two, the forbearance and supreme mundane quality of the 37 harmonies of enlightenment, you fully attain the five strengths, which are like the five powers, but they're even stronger. Because you're getting your mind is getting stronger and stronger at being able to kind of overcome negative things and attain positive. But anyway, this supreme mundane quality level is is actually it's right before the third path, which is the path of seeing. I'm just again, you get it. I'm just describing how a person progresses. Um, and it's pre-mundane quality because what they actually are getting at there is that before the path in Buddhism in general, like it's true of all the Buddhist schools and teachings, there's a this idea that before a being, a sentient being, a being, achieves the path of seeing, they're mundane or they're ordinary. Once you achieve the path of seeing, you're no longer ordinary. And I find that also quite, there's a famous story of the Buddha, like because in Sanskrit, I guess they call it Arya, right? And Arya means noble, usually translated that way. But there's a famous story because in India, Arya was a term, and during the Buddhist time, it was a term that was often used to describe castes, right? So these two young, rich guys showed up and said, "We're Aryas." They were kind of a little full of themselves, like we're high caste. Uh, Same as in America, we don't use that term, but same idea, right? Somebody who's like from a certain socioeconomic group and feels a little uh, inflated, maybe because of that or something. And so the Buddha had been before he left home the son of a king, right? So he had been of that socioeconomic status, and he had renounced it and left, to become an ascetic monk. Monk is part of the term, but anyway, so they say we're Aryas, and then the Buddha starts asking them, "What does it mean to be noble? What does it mean to be an Arya?" And they say, "Well, I was born into this. I was born my parents or whatever." And he says, the Buddha keeps asking questions. He says, "Well, is that really noble? Like you were just born, like that made you noble, more noble than somebody else who was born in a different family?" And you know, they start to kind of question what does it mean to be noble. And finally, the Buddha says, "I don't see any essentially, I don't see any nobility actually in that. In having more than somebody else or in being in a different socioeconomic status than somebody else. First of all, it's not very reliable, is it? Like socioeconomics change, and it doesn't protect you from death. It doesn't protect you from suffering. It doesn't protect. What does that mean? How does that make you noble? I mean, actually, when I was reading that, it makes me think of, or when I study that one, it makes me think of. I remember when I was sitting with my father in hospice, and when he was dying, and I remember like the nurses would go, and one person would say, "I was a garbage man." Somebody else would say, "Oh, I was a CEO." And you would watch the nurse's facial expression. They would say, "Oh, that's great. Do you need more morphine? Now." So like, it's like doesn't really matter at that point, does it? Anyway, going off on a tangent here. Point is that the Buddha defined that Arya, noble, in his tradition. And he said, a noble being is somebody who knows reality. And if you don't know reality, you're not noble. I don't see any nobility in that until you see the nature of how things exist. He said that would make somebody noble. Uh, and then another point, which personally I just love this, is in Buddhist texts they'll talk about childish beings, and I was like, what is a child? I thought, what does that mean? Childish beings. And they said anyone who's not an Arya, anyone who's not achieved the path of seeing is a childish being. I was like, oh, that's a relief. Wow, okay. It's like it's not like and then they say, and once you've seen the nature of reality, you're not childish anymore because you know how things exist. You know how things really are. And So the supreme mundane quality is the last part of being a childish being, the last part of not yet being an Arya, not yet being someone who's seen reality directly. And and so then comes the third path, which is the path of seeing. And of the 37 harmonies of enlightenment, on that level, one achieves the seven branches of enlightenment, which again I'll describe in future class. But um, so what happens? The path of seeing, I had said earlier, right? When one has achieved, on the path of accumulation, one gained a kind of correct conceptual understanding of emptiness. And then on the path, at the beginning of the path of preparation, one gained a union of calm abiding and special insight, understanding the ultimate nature of reality. But all through that, all through those paths, which were genuine, um, clear realizations, right? They were paths, so they were clear realizations about the nature of reality in that case. Excuse me, but they weren't. What's the word? They were still conceptual understandings of the ultimate nature of reality. And what happens on the path of preparation, going back to Jan, what you asked, from these four levels, is there's a metaphor often given by lamas, Tibetan lamas, where they say, it's like if you see something, like if you were looking at a person through, say, like a veil, or like a what is that called? Like what's the material that veils are made of? Gauze or something like that, or some kind of thing like that. So you can see the person, but you see them, um,
Yeah, not with detail.
not you can't see them completely directly.
Mhm.
And the metaphor that they often give is that through these four levels of the path of preparation, it's like that veil is being worn away. So you're seeing it more and more clearly, but there's still the veil there. But like, if you were like wearing out a veil, right? Like it would become thinner and thinner, and you can see more clearly. And at the supreme mundane quality, it's like the veil is still just barely there. And if you can imagine like a veil that's falling apart at this level, right? Finally, the person, like, you know, it just falls to nothing, and you see completely directly
Mm.
what you were looking at before. So the idea here is that all through those previous levels, you were understanding correctly the nature of reality. It was a correct understanding, but there was still a conceptuality to it, which means, which also means conceptuality also implies a sense of subject and object, a differentiation of subject and object. Uh, and with conceptual understanding, there's always some element of, this is right, it's not yet a perfect scene. This is one way to put it. You're not yet seeing it perfectly. You're not seeing it directly. And it's like another way of getting at conceptual versus non-conceptual seeing. We have that, it's like, if you heard a great deal about a certain city that you want to go see, and you read books about it, you have a conceptual understanding of that city, right? If you see pictures and you read books and you hear about it, and you want to go to Montreal, whatever, right? Like, so you could actually get, and you might like look at maps and you'd have a correct understanding. Oh, this is how you get around Montreal, and here's where this is, and I want to go see that part of this town, and I saw the pictures of it at different times of day, and right, you could get quite a good understanding of a certain, and maybe you might read novels about it, and watch movies. You would have a pretty good understanding, but that's not the same as going there, right? And when you go there, it's a different experience. So that's like this, in other words, right? Another way of getting at this point. So on the path of seeing, you go there. Is one way of saying it. Another way of saying it is you experience emptiness non-conceptually. Another way of saying it is you experience it without any subject-object dualism. So a completely non-dualistic experience in meditation, the ultimate nature of reality. And that's the path of seeing. That's the turning point. When you have that moment, you are no longer a childish being. You become an Arya, they say, you become a noble being. And that's irreversible. Buddhist teachings. There's an irreversible experience. That's an irreversible experience no one can ever take away from you. Nothing will ever take away from you in any future life. It's like a turning point in your spiritual development that in every being's spiritual development, that's a certain kind of, it's the most important turning point in some ways, you'd say, on paths. Um, and so that's a very important, clear realization, right? Path. And I'm going to share and a few other points. So one is it's non-dualistic. So while you're having that direct experience of emptiness, there's nothing else. There's no conceptuality. There's also no sensory experience. It's just a meditative absorption, the ultimate experiencing the ultimate nature of reality. Um, Another point which is I think I haven't gotten into in the past, but I think it's useful for because we're getting into the obvious mile in the car. So I'm going to give you a little detail more than I have been about this. Is there are certain parts of that experience that I'm gonna mention now because later we're going to cover the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, and this will be useful to understand this. So, which you experience the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths on the path of seeing. Um, but the first part of the path of seeing is what they call an uninterrupted path, and this is a technical term in Buddhist meditation. Um, and so um, the uninterrupted path is part of is the first part of that direct seeing, and it's served. They say the reason, and it's actually it's an interesting. The person who's having that experience doesn't ever think I'm having the uninterrupted path now. If they were thinking that, they would be in that experience, right? Um, but but from the perspective of later, or from the perspective of somebody else, you can sort of, from the in other words, from the afterwards, for example, a person could look back and go, okay, that was that. Does that make sense? Or or somebody else could look at them and go, oh, that's when they were having this experience. And what's important there is that the uninterrupted path, from their subjective experience, they're just in this meditative equipoise experiencing emptiness. Um, but in terms of their spiritual development, that is serving as an antidote. Um, and I'm going to use the technical term here, an antidote to the objects to be abandoned by the path of seeing. And what that means is this: is when the person has that experience of emptiness, um, it serves as an antidote to certain faults in their being for all future time. They're not thinking, oh, this is serving as an antidote to blah, 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 blah. But when you have that kind of experience, certain negative things can't ever happen again. And so just that experience, when we label it uninterrupted path, what it means is that it's serving as an actual antidote to something. Um, and and we'll get into another class, like what is an antidote to, but there are all kinds of things that you've heard this term actually, cessation, maybe you've probably heard that term. That's what that means, actually, is that that experience causes a cessation of something, certain things, which mean and a cessation means a kind of permanent that will not like, it will never again arise in that person's being, in that person's experience. So the uninterrupted path is an experience that also serves a kind of function of causing a cessation, you could say, or bring about a cessation, and of certain faults or certain kinds of flaws, imperfections in their being. Um, and then after the uninterrupted path, from their experience, there's no change. They're not thinking, oh, now I'm in this, but they then experience what's called the liberated path, and that means they're still in that experience, but now those things have already ceased in their being. And if they were to look back later, they could say, wow, like I had this insight, and ever since then I've been different. These experiences, the certain flaws never arise again. And so they've achieved a kind of liberated path. It means they're still on that experience. A path means insight, right? They're still having the clear realization, but now they're liberated from certain kinds of flaws or certain kinds of imperfections, certain kinds of mental flaws. Yeah, that's a reason to label it. Uh, and then I'm not going to get into this. Then there are certain things called a meditative equipoise that is neither an interrupted nor an uninterrupted path. Um, which we can get into another time. That's I think not as important for our purposes, but I think it's useful to recognize that there's this uh, um, first part is the liberated path. First part is the uninterrupted path, and then a liberated path because it's serving as an antidote, and that's useful. That each because you'll see in the path of meditation also next path that you're going to keep then having these antidotes to have certain cessations, and that's what's happening.
So that generate, I mean, once you have that experience of uninterrupted and then it doesn't, you're not instantaneously anywhere. You just, now you're free to begin scrubbing everything away.
Yep, yeah, and there are going to be all kinds of things you're going to still scrub away. You just
Yeah.
scrub away the very first; those are the first cessations. You
Okay.
can say there are going to be a bunch more cessations to come for that bodhisattva. Um, and another point worth mentioning here is there's also something called uh, there's like the meditative um, equipoise, I guess you call it. Yeah, meditative equipoise is probably a good term. And then there's subsequent attainment, so is another term they use. And with that, or yeah, yeah. Anyway, what my point here is this: is there comes a point where the person gets up from their meditation session, having achieved the path of seeing. At that point, they're on the first bhumi, the first level, the first bodhisattva ground, we call it, of the. Uh, yeah. Anyway, this first, but actually, I'll get into this now, maybe. So what happens then is that when the person gets up, they again have conceptuality, and they see things again, right? They have, they were in this meditative equipoise where all they was experiencing was the ultimate nature of reality. But then they stop, their meditation session ends and they get up, right? And they walk around, they have lunch or whatever, but they're a different kind of being, first of all, at that point. But another point is then they engage in the six perfections. And that's really important, right? So in other words, at that point they say, well, all right, great. Now how do I help others? And on the first bodhisattva ground, the bodhisattva particularly practices generosity, the perfection of generosity. And they become able to practice generosity on a completely different level than they could before. And so they start, and generosity means like they start having fun giving things away, giving to others in all different ways. And they also practice all the perfections. They practice them in an integrated way. Um, and then they go back into meditation, and then they come back out and they practice patience and generosity and joyous, all the different perfections. But particularly generosity. And so that's a brief summary of the path of seeing. And then the fourth path is called the path of meditation. And in essence, meditation means like familiarization. Uh, meditation, familiarization. I mean, you could translate gom, Tibetan word gom, either way. Um, and let's say that go into again. I'm going into a little more detail than I sometimes do. I think that's good because we're actually this is the Abhisamaya Ankara. If we don't do it here, where are we going to do it? So um, this is where it's taught. In other words, but going back to Jan, your question. So this is maybe the important part to understand is so there's a technical point where like on the path of seeing um, begins when the person first directly realizes emptiness, and it continues until the person enters this kind of there's a technical point here, but essentially it begins when the person it begins to abandon the innate obscurations is a technical term here. Um, and it begins when the path of meditation is attained when the bodhisattva attains the uninterrupted path um, at the end of the first ground, which is bringing them into the second bhumi, if that makes sense. So in other words, my point is this: is you imagine it, right? The bodhisattva, when they first realized emptiness directly, non-conceptually, they entered the first ground and also the path of seeing, and then they practice generosity and they do various things, and there comes a point when they've achieved what's the word accumulated enough merit and sort of made enough progress, and they again sit down to meditate, and they again enter an uninterrupted path, a direct realization of emptiness, and it's serving as an antidote to something that right uninterrupted path means an antidote, and what's an antidote to at that point are certain kinds of what I'm going to get. I'll explain this in a second, but innate obstructions or innate obscurations. mental obscurations, or yeah, obscurations. And it's actually interesting. So at that point, the person has entered the path of meditation. That's the entry point to the path of meditation, the fourth of the five paths. And then they technically, this is technical, which you don't probably won't remember, but when the person enters the what's it called, the liberated path in that meditation session, they've also achieved now the second bhumi, and of the 10 bhumis.
So is that the structure for the boomies in terms of you go through a similar experience, only the second time you can recognize it more quickly.
Actually, the difference now again, well, actually, I'll explain the difference now. So just to get at the second, what the difference is so they're different. You said washing, like what was the word you used? Washing their, or cleaning up
Oh,
their, yeah.
yeah, wiping away.
And that's kind of what's so on the path. So now what's going to happen for the bodhisattva is this: is there said to be small, great, and medium levels of mental obscurations. And of those, they break them down, as often happens in Buddhism. They break them down to sub levels. So there's core, there's like so. And I want to first say, what does it mean? Mental obscurations, great, subtle, and great, medium, and subtle. There are very coarse, gross levels. For example, of, like they're like, and we know this from our own experience. Actually, in this part, we don't know the cessation part, but we know the mental affliction part. We're familiar with, most of us, I think. And there's a difference, right, between like I'll give an example, like a coarse level, right? There are coarse and gross levels of, like, for example, if you're completely filled with craving, right, or anger, that's very coarse, isn't it?
Right.
But even like then there are very subtle levels of craving. Even when you're, for example, in meditation, when you're, there's a big difference between, for example, like between like being desperate for ice cream or something, and and then when you're in meditation, you're subtly attached to the pleasure of the meditation, for example. Those are very different levels of experience, aren't they?
Right.
Um, Also, like, a huge difference between, right, like when you're feeling, like, when somebody's feeling hatred for somebody, right, wants to kill them, versus a very subtle aversion, right, where there's a very subtle level of aversion. I'm just giving examples of, they're all different levels of mental affliction. And part of the point here is this: is they call it here in this translation, they're calling him great, um, or coarse. I don't know. I'm trying to think what do you call. I would call them maybe coarse or great. I don't know. I'm not sure which way you call it, but anyway, they're like course of the core. They're course. They're a middle course, and they're small, and then they're like smaller course. And then of the middle level, they're course of the middle level and middle of the middle. And so they're breaking it down into like 9 levels of mental afflictions. But then on the so and then and of the first, there's of the grade of the course of the course, there's extremely, I would say, like extremely coarse of course, and there's subtly coarse of course.
Sounds like me buying sandpaper the other day.
Yeah, yeah, it's like that. Exactly. You get it. That's a good metaphor. Sandpaper, he said. It's like sand levels of sandpaper to how fine you're gonna. Is a good example. And so part of the point here is this: is why are explaining all that? First of all, one point is we have all those mental afflictions, unfortunately. Uh, Fortunately, though, on these different on the path of so on the first ground, the one we already covered, right? On the path of seeing, on the first ground, you eliminate completely what they here are calling the course of the great mental affliction. Um, then on the second ground, you are getting rid of the subtle of the great afflictions. On the third ground, you're getting rid of or having a cessation of the medium of the great mental afflictions. And that's why it takes years, exactly. That's part of why it takes. They actually say ordinarily, just to get to the path of seeing takes one countless great eon.
One what?
Countless great eon. Then from the path of seeing to the eighth bhumi takes another countless great eon. And then from the eighth bhumi to Buddhahood takes the third countless great eon. And by the way, that's why for ordinary bodhisattvas, it takes 3 countless great eons. I'll mention something now as a side. This is an aside point, but this is why on the ordinary bodhisattva path it takes three countless gradients to achieve Buddhahood. Um, One point that the Tibetan Buddhist, Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition shares is that it's possible, though, there's a unique tradition in the Tibetan Buddhist lineages called highest yoga tantra. And the unique feature of that, a unique feature of that tradition is that they say that through practicing it, it's possible for a being to achieve Buddhahood in one, as a phrase they use, one brief lifetime in the degenerate era. That's what we're in. This is the degenerate era. One brief lifetime is a human life that's 100 years. Up to maximum is around 100 years. So if you practice, they say that if you practice highest yoga tantra, then it's possible. That's a unique feature of that is that it's possible to achieve enlightenment in one life or in 7 lives or at the most in 16 lives. That's the way they teach it. And I'm mentioning that partly because Jan we'd had a brief conversation. It's very rare for somebody to give empowerment into that lineage if somebody's ready to take that empowerment. And Gimei Khenpo Rinpoche will be giving those in one in Connecticut in March. So if people are interested, the center might organize like people could go up together or something. But if people are interested in that, that's an option for March. Gimei Khenpo Rinpoche will be on the East Coast and giving that level of empowerment into a system called the Yamantaka Highest Yoga Tantra. And so anyway, that's an option for people. I just wanted to mention that so people are aware of it. But anyway, going back, so there are these 10 bhumis, and they correlate to these 10 levels of mental afflictions. And you get the point of why I mentioned now earlier the uninterrupted path and the liberated path is that's an important part of those, is that at each of those bhumis, what's actually happening is that one is experiencing again this kind of meditative equipoise of an uninterrupted path that's serving as the antidote for some level of those mental afflictions. And then they're achieving the liberated path. And then they arise from meditation and they go around and they do the bodhisattva activities. And I'll also just mention, because again, I don't know when else I would mention it really, is the 10 bhumis, right? The most probably one very important point is that the bodhisattva is getting rid of those mental afflictions in that way, step by step, right? And again, remember I said earlier, like you can't jump over. Part of that is that it's not possible through this kind of path to get rid of say the subtle ones if you haven't got rid of the gross ones. Um, um, Highest Yoga Tantra circumvents that, by the way, by using a subtler level of consciousness. That's how it does it. Highest Yoga Tantra uses the subtle level of consciousness that ordinarily only manifests at the time of death to meditate on emptiness. So it uses a very subtle level of consciousness, which is the clear light of death, to meditate on emptiness, which serves as a more powerful antidote. That's part of what the Dalai Lama emphasizes when he teaches Highest Yoga Tantra. Yeah.
Like what if, so that means that third time there would be like born, like having already done two of these, like so they're on the third part of path, but they would be born without, like with the same awareness as a baby. So what's the difference between someone who was born then and then born at the first level?
It's a great question. And I'll share like I'll share like I mean I could say technically, but I'll share like an example. Like I was actually I'll share a story, I guess, that relates to that. I think gets at what you're getting at. Is one day I was talking to a friend of mine he was born in Europe. He's a monk who's spent years and years in meditation. Has made a lot of progress in this life. And he was talking about Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's both of our teachers. And he was making an interesting point, whereas he said he was saying that like for himself, right? He's a monk. He went into retreat. He wanted to practice. He studied, and he was saying, oh, it took years and years to develop certain abilities to meditate in these ways. And then he was saying he was asking Lama Zopa Rinpoche about that, and he was saying like, oh, all these obstacles happen, and it's hard to, he was saying from his own experience, he was like, it's really hard to make progress. And and what he realized was that like as he was talking with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he realized that like Lama Zopa Rinpoche had been like the person you're describing in the previous lives. He had already been this great master. He was a reincarnate of that other person. And he was saying like when Lama Zopa Rinpoche reached a certain age, like a teenager, and he sort of somebody taught him how to meditate. He sat down to meditate. He immediately achieved calm abiding, and then he achieved like so. It didn't happen when he was a baby, but as soon as he was like old enough to sit down and meditate and learn the instructions and tried to meditate, all these experiences came like one after another, and then he picked up wherever that was, I guess.
Information, like the type of knowledge, this like then sticks. Once it's introduced again, like very.
It's almost like dormant, and then it becomes seems given those instructions.
Yeah, and it was the same thing actually. I'm just now reading. A Tibetan friend of mine asked me to read it over. He wrote like a biography of the spiritual experiences of the Dalai Lama, current Dalai Lama, where he like used a lifetime of quotes and interviews and people who knew the Dalai Lama, and he was saying the same thing. That he there was a point where the Dalai Lama was saying like he was a young man, young adult, and he was talking to some of the greatest scholars of Tibet and great yogis, scholars, and he was like, and the Dalai Lama had to suddenly realize that like when his teacher had explained a certain topic to him, he meditated on it and he understood it. And then he was talking to this other monk who had spent like 40 or 50 years studying and meditating on that topic. And the Dalai Lama was like, oh wow, I understand the way he and I have the same understanding of it. And I was like, oh, I must have karma from a past life because this other monk took 40 years to gain that understanding, and I understood it as soon as my teacher. And then he was like realizing most people didn't understand it the way he did, right? Like as soon as his teacher explained to him, he suddenly had this insight. And so he was sharing, like, I mean, he was in a private conversation with somebody where he was describing, but this guy was then using that in the book to describe, but he was pointing out that the Dalai Lama was like, oh, that helped the Dalai Lama understand how he was saying, like, oh, well, that's because over many lifetimes I practiced that. So I had a kind of imprints of that. Whereas for other people, it's harder.
Like manifest as being like a savant,
Yeah.
or like being really brilliant at something, right? Like
Yeah.
some people just really grasp on like real quick, and you wonder where does that come from? Well, from a Buddhist perspective, it would be well from the karma you created in your past lives practice.
Exactly.
Briefly, just to tag on to your story, His Holiness was once asked if if he still experienced anger, and he says, much, but still. So I'm assuming that's a very subtle level.
Yeah, it could be a subtle kind of.
But he did not the coarser one.
Yeah. Well, other comments or questions actually while we're pausing.
What is, thank you
Yeah.
very much. What is meant by the term ornament?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So oh, I wonder if I still have it marked. There is this beautiful description where actually they got at there were like various kind. Oh, here it is. There are various meanings. Actually, there are a whole bunch of meanings of the ornament. Um, and there it is. I should answer it elaborately for a second because I thought it's a fun question. Um, the tradition actually says that there's they say there are four connotations: the natural ornament, the beautifying ornament, the clarifying ornament, and the joyful ornament. But I'll describe it. So what they're getting at is this is and there I'll use I'm going to use it as a metaphor for a second. Uh then like a natural ornament would be like um if you imagine like a very attractive person, just their attractiveness itself would be their natural ornamentation. And they say in the metaphor here, that's like the Prajnaparamita Sutra itself, that is naturally beautiful. Um, then they say you can further adorn a person, like, a person might wear bracelets or a necklace or whatever, some kind of ornaments. Um, and that would further beautify them, right? Uh, and then there's something called a clarifying ornament, and that would be like a mirror. And what they're getting at is it's like a mirror in which you can see all the beauty of that being at once. And and then the commentary says, and then the last is the joyful ornament, and that's the joy you feel when you see that. So if you imagine like there's this beautiful person, they're ornamented, and then you see them in the mirror and you feel joy. It's making a story here. And what they're saying is the ornament for clear realizations is like so, and one point is that the jewel ornaments, let's say, they don't change the beauty of the person, but they bring your attention. Like, oh, that's you notice their ears more, for example, if they're wearing an earring or something. And by the way, I mean here it's funny when I say that, of course, being an American implies a woman, but in India, of course, men or women would wear those. So I'll point that out. In Indian culture, that's not unique to women. But anyway, although the Prajnaparamita is said to be female as a metaphor, so maybe it's okay. It's women. But the point here is this: is that in a sense, it's like that. So the Prajnaparamita itself is like the natural beauty. Then so one point is that some of these different clarifications or points are drawing your attention to certain aspects of the Prajnaparamita. And then the Abhisamaya Alamkara as a whole, the order for clear realizations as a whole, is like the mirror in which you can see the meaning of the entire Prajnaparamita clearly. And then the joyful element is you feel joy. If you really gain an understanding of that, you feel kind of joy. And so that's the meaning of ornament for clear realizations. um, and then John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. That term uninterrupted path, that kind of puzzled me, and that helped to discuss it. So just to clarify and make sure I get the point, is a sense of uninterrupted meaning that the mind is no longer distracted, but fully absorbed in the realization, and thereby gains the power to have the actual antidotes to the mental afflictions that are being addressed. Because I know you were kind of equating it to an antidote, but is that sense of an antidote, does it come from that full absorption? Is that the meaning of uninterrupted, is that the mind is no longer distracted, but fully absorbed in the realization, so that it thereby has the strength, to fully counteract the things that are being ceased?
In this text, I mean, in the text I have in front of me, it doesn't give the etymology of uninterrupted, but I've heard lamas explain that like that. I think if I remember it right, I'm a little hesitant because I'm going to make sure I'm hoping I remember it correctly what a couple different lamas have said about that. But I think there are two connotations. One is that you know because it's a direct, non-conceptual, non-dualistic experience of emptiness, nothing interrupts it. That's one sort of I think connotation. But I think the other is that yeah, that through that I think as you said, that through that, or through the power of that, or through the efficaciousness of that, that in other words, that there's nothing, what's the say, right? That in and of itself serves as the antidote. And there's nothing in between. It's not like in other words, that just that experience itself in a kind of uninterrupted way serves the function of being an antidote to the mental afflictions. Um, and that and that while the person is in that experience of the uninterrupted path, um, there is that cessation that occurs, and then immediately afterwards, while they're still in a meditative absorption, they enter the liberated path where they no longer, the ability to give rise to those mental flaws has ceased in that sense. So I think those are the connotations of uninterruptedness. I think so.
Yeah, thank you. And one other point, and I'm not sure at what point this comes in the text, because I've been reading a commentary, but there's the statement that all 37 harmonies, all realizations within those harmonies are attained at the path of seeing. And then it didn't really expound upon that. And so I try to understand that, I can apply two perspectives to it. One, it seems contradictory, because if in fact you attain all 37 harmonies at the path of seeing, then what's the function of the path of meditation? It seems like you've already accomplished that. But then, what you were discussing earlier, I think maybe gets at the point is that, of course, you have that critical realization of the prajna paramita at the path of seeing, but that during the path of meditation, it becomes more refined, and that you begin, just having more subtle realizations that were somewhat more coarse, during the path of seeing. So is that the way to get at how attaining all 37 harmonies at the path of seeing is a valid statement? Or
I'm not sure because what they actually this commentary, one commentary I have in front of me says you don't. The last of the 37, the last 7 of the 37 are the 8 branches of the Arya paths, and those are said not to be fully attained until the path of meditation. So it's possible. I mean, I guess one could say, of course, one practices those. Like so those 8 branches of the Arya paths, one starts them now. Actually, for example, like one of those is right livelihood. We're supposed to start that now, or right concentration and so on, but you don't fully achieve those until the path of meditation. So, and we practice all of them at any point on the path. You're supposed to be, but so it's possible. I guess one way to say it is that, so I'm not really sure how, I guess you could say that you can't say they're all fully attained at that point, maybe is one way to put it. Um, but then the other thing is that, on the small level of the path of accumulation, one is said to, fully actualize the 4 close placements of mindfulness. So, but then you also continue practicing. There's in the commentaries they also say you continue practicing those 4 close placements of mindfulness all the way until Buddhahood. So it's not that you stop practicing them. So I'm not sure. That I mean, obviously they are all achieved to a certain degree on the first bhumi, but I don't think you could say they're fully achieved.
yeah, it seems like fully is a key word, and it's that when you have that that essential realization at path of seeing, that it's like a seed that comes to maturation as you continue in the path of familiarization. So
Yeah,
that's the sense I was making of it.
makes sense. And then, Robin, did you have your hand up too, or I thought you did?
Thank you. Hi. I'm wondering about, and as we go along, maybe we can have a greater clarification of the realizations of Pratyeka Buddhas and Shravakas versus the Bodhisattva's understanding, because I think my understanding is that at the path of seeing, there are Arya beings who are Pratyeka Buddhas and Shravakas, but then I guess that they're not going to start the process of the bhumis, of the paramitas. And so in relation to that, it'd be interesting to know their level of understanding of emptiness at that level, because and how can it be a complete understanding of emptiness if you're a Shravaka or Pratyeka Buddha at that level? I guess it goes into it, doesn't it, when you're talking about Yogacara, Svatantika, tenet, or path. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. First of all, yeah, you're right. I mean, one point I'll make, Robin, she was asking about how is it different when somebody's on the individual vehicle. Either there are 2 vehicles of individual liberation, the Shravaka vehicle and the Pratyeka Buddha vehicle, and how are those different than a bodhisattva in terms of this? One point I'll say, which I'm going to cover anyway. So I mean, I guess not today, because we're out of time, but next time, next week, is the this I'd said before, this text, the Abhisamalamkara, in terms of Buddhist like philosophical tenet schools, it's presented from the perspective of the Yogacara Svatantrika Majjhamaka, right? So the Yogacara is like, yeah, so that's the technical term for it, which is one of the philosophical schools of Indian Buddhism. And that's partly because the author of the commentary to this was, they say that the text itself by Maitreya, he taught it from that perspective. And then Haribhadra was a philosopher in that school, and he wrote the most important commentary to this text. But um, one thing we'll get into I'm going to do a summary of the that school's tenets. And that school has a different presentation in relation to your point than the consequentialist Prasangika Madhyamikas. So, in other words, they differ on that point. So I'll explain their position on it when we next class next week. Um, but so that I'll wait to explain when I say it then because I'm going to cover that next class. But I want to make one point though that's because we won't get to it. It's not part of this chapter, but it is in the Abhisamayalankara, a certain elaboration on what you're saying, which is that these different like coarse and subtle levels of mental afflictions, um, Prajeka Buddhas and Shravakas do not traverse the bhumis because their bhumis are unique to bodhisattvas, but they do have to eliminate all those different mental afflictions. Um, and that's partly there's a whole section of the Abhisamayalankara that explains about that actually. That's in the I think first chapter, if I remember right. That talks about like it actually is a beautiful section of the Abhisamayalankara, where if you like when we take this refuge in the three jewels in Buddhism, there's the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, and the Sangha jewel. And there's a section of the Abhisamayalankara that says, "What is the Sangha jewel?" And of course it's the Abhisamayalankara, so it's not going to give a brief answer. It gives an elaborate answer, and and it goes through, for if you're talking about the Bodhisattva Sangha, then it's these Arya beings who are on the bhumis. But in that section, it also says, how about the Prajeka Buddha Sangha and the Shravaka Sangha, which is what you're asking about in part. And then it goes through at a very elaborate description where it talks about, actually, if you read in the sutras, there's a description of, in many of the ancient Buddhist scriptures, you'll see there, it says somebody can be a stream enterer, a once returner, a non-returner, or an arhat. Um, and those are and a stream enter is somebody who's an Arya who's seen emptiness directly, and it explains that. And then it starts to elaborate and says those different categories: the stream enter, once returner, non-returner, in the Shravaka and the Prajeka Buddha vehicles are beings who have eliminated some of the, unless you're an Arhat, those other ones have eliminated some of the mental afflictions, but not others. And it starts elaborating which ones has a stream enter eliminated and which is it not. And it even gets into, it's a very elaborate teaching that gets into in terms of this uninterrupted path and liberated path. There's a term, I shouldn't go into it much, but there's a whole thing where they talk about stream enterers, or somebody who's just entering the stream enter and they're on the uninterrupted path. And then there's the stream enter abider who's achieved the liberated path of that level, and which mental afflictions they've eliminated, which have they not. And basically what it elaborates on is there are many, I think it gets through 20 kinds of sanghas. I can't remember the exact, I think it was 20. Um, but it goes through, basically that they've eliminated different levels of Prajeka Buddhas and Shravakas as they progress through their paths, and as they eliminate excuse me, as they gradually eliminate more and more of the mental afflictions. Because they still have to eliminate all these different mental afflictions. But they don't achieve Buddhahood, and they don't accumulate the merit that is needed to become a Buddha, but they do eliminate all the mental afflictions. So that's clarified in the Abhisamayalankara in a lot of detail, actually, as how they do eliminate them. And part of that is that there are certain levels of, say, attachment that are connected to like the form realms or the formless realms, which are meditative experiences. So they have to eliminate those, for example. And if they only eliminate the mental afflictions associated with the desire realm, there are still remaining mental afflictions associated with the form and formless realms, which are part of the subtler levels of mental afflictions that we're not even aware of because we don't have those experiences. But if you meditate at those levels, then you discover that you have those kinds of attachments, and you have to overcome those attachments, for example. So there are teachings on that, but that's a more general point. But then when I get to the Yogacara, Svatantrika, Pajavaka tenets, I'll explain the unique ways in which this school says answers your question about the difference between what is eliminated. And again, that is different than what the consequentialist Prasangika Majamaka say, but I'll present it from this school's perspective because it's interesting.
Thank you.
But I actually want to make sure before we stop, I want to cover one more point, or two more quick points before we stop. One is, so also the 10 grounds, right? I said there, and the path of meditation is the second through the 10th ground. And I'll just say very briefly, the first ground, I'll just gonna give a quick summary because I think it's beautiful actually. The first ground is called the very joyous, because they say it's very joyful to achieve the direct realization of emptiness and become an Arya. And on the first ground, there there's a terminology they say there is or there are 10 perfections. Sometimes it's taught 6 perfections, sometimes it's taught there are 10 perfections. If you teach 10, the last 4 are elaborations of the perfection of wisdom, the 6. But you only become perfect at the perfections when you're a Buddha. But at each of the grounds, you become surpassing at them. You achieve a kind of surpassing ability in that perfection. So on the very joyous first ground, you become surpassing in your ability to practice generosity. And by the way, there are stories in the Buddhism where, like, they say that before you achieve like that level, you're not supposed to like free, um, you're not supposed to give away certain things. You're not yet able. You don't try to give away your head, for example. But they say on the first ground, you're like excited. Oh, now I get to give away my head. You know, because at that level you're past attachment to your body and you can emanate other bodies, and it's no longer a sacrifice to give away your head because you're at a different level of spiritual development. So they say don't try that yourself, but when you get to that level, it's fine to do it. You know, and then on the second ground is called stainless, and you become surpassing in the practice of ethics, such that they say bodhisattvas at the second ground on the level of ethics, where they're surpassing even in their dreams, they're perfectly ethical. So they become able to do that. Then the third ground is the luminous, and in that one, you become surpassing in your practice of patience. And there are beautiful stories of Shakyamuni Buddha where he was able to be patient even with horrible things, and he was like, "Wow, I get to do that now." They like go around looking for difficult people at that ground so that they can practice patience because they're able to do it at that level. Then the fourth ground is the radiant, where you become surpassing in your practice of joyful effort. The fifth ground is difficult to overcome, where you become surpassing in your practice of concentration. And I used to think, what does that mean? Because you've already achieved calm abiding before you achieve the first ground. But what they actually said, there are beautiful teachings where they describe on that ground the bodhisattva can enter different meditative states, like if even if you achieve calm abiding, you have to like sit. Ordinary person who's not yet at that level, it takes effort to achieve a certain meditative state. It might take a while, it might take some time, and then it's hard to shift from one to another. Whereas at that level, they're able to jump from different meditative states and enter different ones very quickly and move between them. So they achieve a kind of surpassing ability in concentration. Then the manifest sixth ground, and the person becomes surpassing in their practice of the perfection of wisdom, prajnaparamita practice. And then the last four, or the last 4 perfections, the seventh is gone afar, is the name of that bhumi, and they become surpassing in their practice of skillful means. The eighth is the immovable ground, where they become surpassing in their ability to do of prayer. In this sense, prayer doesn't mean like, oh, they're good at praying. It's like they're able to do things like at that level, they've achieved so much good karma that they create certain prayers like when I'm a like the medicine Buddha, when I'm a Buddha, may I be a medicine Buddha, and may all beings who pray to me be healed. Or Amitabha, who said, may I create like a pure land where beings who can't get to other pure lands can go there and it'll be joyful and they'll be able to progress and not fall back. And so they become able to like kind of, it's not like they just do prayer. It's like they become able to kind of do these efficacious prayers for when I become a Buddha, may I be like this, and different, that's why there are different kinds of Buddhas, and
Oh, cool.
that,
It's an interesting. I
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
know that.
Yeah, or like, and that was like Tara, right, who said, may I, when I become a Buddha, may I always manifest as female in every universe. May I be able to set an example of a female Buddha where there are no female Buddhas. Manjushri, who said, "Well, even when I'm a Buddha, may I show up as a bodhisattva and ask questions about wisdom, because um, that will inspire all the Buddhas in all their Buddha fields to explain wisdom. And where beings are ignorant, may I show up and ask a lot of questions, be that kind of Buddha. So you can like, that's what I mean by prayer there. And then the ninth is good intelligence, which is they complete the perfection of power. And the 10th bhumi, 10th round is clouds of Dharma, where they achieve surpassing ability and exalted wisdom. And then once the bodhisattvas achieve that 10th bhumi, they're at the final ground. And they then they achieve the 5th path after that. of the 5 paths, which is they call it the path of no more learning. And what that means is that they become an omniscient Buddha. So there's no more path to learn. Um, um, in a sense, a Buddha still actually it's interesting. In one way, in one sense, you could say a Buddha. I've thought about it, just my own reflections, not what the teachings say, but I'll just share. In one sense, you would have to say a Buddha doesn't. The Buddha is omniscient, so they learn something new. Maybe not exactly, but on the other hand, like because reality is, that what exists is changing. In a sense, the Buddha is always learning, since but they don't have. It's no longer conceptual. They no longer have any conceptual. Their learning is direct perception. Is all direct perception. Um, they see everything directly.
Having you, I think I remember you teaching before that omniscience in Buddhism it sounds a little different than it might in a Western context, in that like in Buddhism the future, some things in the future are not determined yet because free will and how people react to their karma and whatnot. And so like a Buddha might say like, well that's not known yet. Um, where in the Western culture, if you were to say something's omniscient, you would be like, oh, he knows, like the way they talk about God and Christianity. God knows everything that's going to happen and everything that has happened, and that's it. It's different.
Actually, and that was I shared very briefly. I mean, that was a point I was confused about once, and so I went to I went to Gyume Khenso Rinpoche, my teacher, and I said like, how is there free will if you know all the future? Because they say the Buddhas know the past, present, and future. And then Khenso Rinpoche said, what's the definition of future? And I said, no, it's that which hasn't happened yet. Or so I was like, I was, and he said, in Buddhism, the definition they define it. They say the future is, what's it say right? That which has not yet occurred but will occur. And so if something has, and so it means it's already determined. You know, so and so and he said, so that's what a Buddha knows. A Buddha knows in the present things that will definitely happen in the future. So for example, if a person's born, the Buddha knows they'll die because everything that's born dies. That's inevitable. But there are certain things that are not, if something's not inevitable, then the Buddha doesn't know it because it's not inevitable. It's not yet a future. It's not yet a future phenomenon, you could say, which is kind of a funny way to think of it. But that's the Buddhist stance. So yeah, it's getting at what you're saying and that for me that clarified how there's still free will. That right, the Buddha knows, and that was where I said that before. But in certain stories, you'll see where the Buddha will say, "This being will become enlightened at this time in the future," because all the causes are already set, so the result will happen. And then there are other stories where somebody says, like, "When will I become enlightened?" The Buddha says that cannot be predicted yet. Meaning they don't have all the causes set, so nobody could predict that because it's not yet determinable. So, um, anyway, we went past the time a bit, so we should stop. But there is class next week, so we got through the 5 paths, and next time, just so people know, next time my plan is to go through the what I said, the unique things about the Yogacara, Svatantrika, Majamaka philosophical tenets. And then if there's time past that, we'll start to look at the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, which is an elaboration on the Four Noble Truths. If not, then we'll do that the following. But dedication. So the supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are labeled totally empty from their own sides, that the I, who is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled totally empty from their own side to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And lastly, may we all of us, through this effort, may we actually be able to traverse those 5 paths, in order to become a fully enlightened Buddha for the welfare of ourselves and all sentients. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Lynn. Stop the recording. See y'all next week.
Yeah, see you next week. It's back to back.